Good morning and welcome to your Farm and Home Show. I'm Kristi Shive, and this morning we're visiting with Dr. Heather Norman Burgdolf. She's an assistant extension professor for the University of Kentucky. Good morning, Heather.
Good morning, Kristi.
Heather, many people are unsure of when to use table salt or kosher salt. Could you talk us through the differences and when each should be used, and when should we be using iodized table salt?
So let's start with sea salt or kosher salt. They have a larger, flakier crystal, which are typically used to season the outside of foods during cooking. Or maybe if you're at the stovetop, it's the type of salt that you would use throughout the cooking process as you season your food. They tend to dissolve slower than smaller crystals, and they may not distribute evenly if used while baking. So I tend to think of this salt as being the one when you're cooking and not baking. These larger crystals, they may also provide more flavor with less sodium per teaspoon. So you may not need as much to get that salty or savory flavor that you're trying to get. With table salt, which is often iodized, it's typically used more in baking because it dissolves faster. It's that smaller crystal, and it can distribute evenly throughout that baked good. And when it's used during the cooking process, or it's on the outside of food, it can quickly make food taste too salty. Typically, that kosher salt or sea salt might be better in those circumstances. Now, you asked about iodized salt, and that's a great question because about 80% of households around the world use iodized salt when they're cooking and they're baking. And iodized salt is simply table salt that has iodine added to it. Now, iodine is a micronutrient that is absolutely necessary for our bodies to make thyroid hormone. And iodine deficiency used to be a public health concern. And so thinking about how to address this public health concern and this micronutrient deficiency, they decided to add iodine to table salt. And it's been incredibly effective at reducing iodine deficiency around the world and the formation of like an enlarged thyroid gland, or goiters, if you've heard of that before. So iodine is also naturally found in dairy, grains, eggs, and seafood. A lot of those foods may not be eaten across all populations. But what we know is that iodized salt is recognized as safe, and there are no studies to suggest that iodine added to salt negatively affects our health in any way.
Heather, what about gourmet salts that we are starting to see, like pink or Himalayan?
Yes, so gourmet salts are typically sold at a premium. So keep that in mind. They are going to be much more expensive than either table salt or, purchasing kosher salt in bulk, for example. And one of the reasons is because they do have unique flavors and they have unique appearances. So they're going to come at a little bit higher price tag. These salts contain very similar amounts of sodium as other salts, but are just much more expensive. And since they're so expensive and they really vary in their crystal size, they are often used as a finishing salt. So it might be something that you add at the end so that their unique flavor can actually contribute to the dish and they're not lost during that cooking process.
Now, Heather, we do hear that some salts are healthier than others. Is this true?
So some suggest that certain forms of salt, like sea salt or pink Himalayan salt, are healthier than others because they contain like trace amounts of minerals. So very, very, very small amounts of certain minerals. And although it is true that they do contain more micronutrients, the amounts are so small, it may not be worth paying that premium price for those salts specifically for the extra nutrition. So there are other sources in the diet that can provide these micronutrients more readily and without that increase in sodium in the diet. And really, there's no substantial scientific evidence to suggest that these types of salts are superior to other forms because of that micronutrient composition.
Before we wrap up, can you tell us how much salt or sodium should we have in our diets?
Yes, all of these salts, regardless of the type, are going to contribute to sodium in our diet. And it's recommended by the Dietary Guidelines that we consume less than 2,300 milligrams per day. And those who have high blood pressure or at risk for heart disease really should keep that at about 1,500 milligrams or less per day. So just keep that in mind when you're making any choice about any type of salt on the shelf.
Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Farm and Home Show, and we'll see you next time.